Once upon a time, in the city of New York, a beautiful baby boy was born into this world, and the joyful parents named him Lexington. No sooner had the mother returned home from the hospital carrying Lexington in her arms than she said to her husband, "Darling, now you must take me out to a most marvelous restaurant for dinner, so that we can celebrate the arrival of our son and heir." Her husband embraced her tenderly and told her that any woman who could produce such a beautiful child as Lexington deserved to go absolutely anywhere she wanted. But was she strong enough yet, he inquired, to start running around the city late at night? No, she said, she wasn't. But what the hell? So that evening, they both dressed up themselves in fancy clothes and leaving little Lexington in the care of a trained infant's nurse, who was costing them $20 a day and was Scottish in the bargain. They went out to the finest and most expensive restaurant in town. There they each ate a giant lobster and drank a bottle of champagne between them. And after that they went on to the nightclub where they drank another bottle of champagne. And they sat holding hands for several hours while they recalled and discussed and admired each individual physical feature of their lovely newborn son. They arrived back at their house on the east side of Manhattan around 2 o'clock in the morning, and the husband paid off the taxi driver and then began feeling in his pockets for the key of the front door. After a while, he announced that he must have left it in the pocket of his other suit, and he suggested that they ring a bell and get the nurse to come down and let them in. An infant's nurse at $20 a day must be expected to be hauled out of bed occasionally in the night, the husband said. So he rang the bell. They waited. Nothing happened. He rang it again, long and loud. They waited another minute. Then they both stepped out back onto the street and shouted the nurse's name, "McPottle," up at the nursery windows on the third floor. But there was still no response. The house was dark and silent. The wife began to grow apprehensive. Her baby was imprisoned in this place, she told herself, alone with McPottle. And who was McPottle? They had known her for 2 days, and that was all. She had a thin mouth and a small disapproving eye and a starchy bosom, and quite clearly she was in the habit of sleeping too soundly for safety. If she couldn't hear the front door bell, how on earth did she expect to hear a baby crying? Why, this very second, the poor thing might be swallowing its tongue or suffocating on its pillow. "He doesn't have a pillow," the husband said. "You are not to worry, but I'll get you in if that's what you want." He was feeling rather superb after all the champagne, and now he bent down and undid the laces of one of his black patent leather shoes and took it off. Then, holding him by the toe, he flung it hard and straight through the dining room window on the ground floor. "There you are," he said, grinning. "We'll deduct it from McPottle's wages." He stepped forward and very carefully put a hand through the hole in the glass and released the catch. Then he raised the window. "I shall lift you in first, little mother," he said. And he took his wife around the waist and lifted her up off the ground. This brought her big red mouth up level with his own and very close, so he started kissing her. He knew from experience that women like very much to be kissed in this position and with their bodies held tight and their legs dangling in the air, so he went on doing it for quite some long time, and she wiggled her feet and made loud gulping noises down her throat. Finally, the husband turned her around and began easing her gently through the open window in the dining room. At this point, a police patrol car came nosing silently along the street toward them. It stopped about 30 yards away, and 3 cops of Irish extraction leaped out of the car and started running in their direction with the husband and wife brandishing revolvers. "Stick him up," the cop shouted. "Stick him up." But it wasn't possible for the husband to obey this order without letting go of his wife, and had he done this, she would either have fallen to the ground or would have been left dangling half in and half out of the house. which is a terribly uncomfortable position for a woman, so he continued gallantly to push her upward and inward through the window. The cops, all of who received medals before for killing robbers, opened fire immediately. And although they were still running, and although the wife in particular was presenting them with a very small target indeed, they succeeded in scoring several direct hits upon each body, sufficient anyway to prove fatal in both cases. Thus, when he was no more than 12 days old, little Lexington became an orphan. 2. The news of this killing, for which the 3 policemen subsequently received citations, was eagerly conveyed to all the relatives of the deceased couple by newspaper reporters, and the next morning the closest of these relatives, as well as a couple of undertakers, 3 lawyers, and a priest, climbed into taxis and set out for the house with the broken window. They assembled in the living room, men and women both, and they sat around in a circle on the sofas and armchairs, smoking cigarettes and sipping sherry and debating what on earth should be done now with the baby upstairs. The orphan Lexington. It became soon apparent that none of the relatives was particularly keen to assume responsibility for the child, and the discussions and arguments continued all through the day. Everybody declared an enormous, almost irresistible desire to look after him, and would have done so with the greatest of pleasure were it not for the fact that their apartment was so small, or they already had one baby and couldn't possibly afford another, or they wouldn't know what to do with the poor little thing when they went abroad in the summer, or that they were getting on in years, which surely would be most unfair to the boy when he grew up, and so on and so forth. They all knew, of course, that the father had been heavily in debt for a long time, and that the house was mortgaged, and that consequently there would be no money at all to go with the child. They were still arguing like mad at 6 in the evening when suddenly, in the middle of it all, an old aunt of his deceased father, her name was Glosspan, swept in from Virginia, and without even removing her hat and coat, not even pausing to sit down, ignoring all the offers of a martini, a whiskey, a sherry, she announced firmly to the assembled relatives that she herself intended to take charge of the infant boy from then on. What was more, she said, she would assume full financial responsibility on all counts, including education, and everyone else could go back to home where they belong and give their consciences a rest. So saying, she trotted upstairs to the nursery and snatched Lexington from his cradle and swept out of the house with the baby clutched tightly in her arms, while the relatives simply sat and stared and smiled, and looked relieved. And McPottle, the nurse, stood stiff with disapproval at the head of the stairs, her lips compressed, her arms folded against her starchy bosom. And thus it was that the infant Lexington, when he was 13 days old, left the city of New York and traveled southward to live with his great aunt Glosspan in the state of Virginia. Three. Aunt Glosspan was nearly 70 when she became guardian to Lexington, but to look at her you would never have guessed it for 1 minute. She was as sprightly as a woman half her age, with a small, wrinkled, but still quite beautiful face and 2 lovely brown eyes that sparkled at you in the nicest way. She was also a spinster, although you would never have guessed that either, for there was nothing spinsterish about Aunt Glosspan. She was never bitter, nor gloomy, nor irritable. She didn't have a mustache, and she wasn't in the least bit jealous of other people, which in itself is something you can seldom say about either for a spinster or a virgin lady, although, of course, it is not known for certain whether Aunt Glosspan qualified on both accounts. But she was an eccentric old woman, there was no doubt about that. For the past 30 years, she'd lived in a strange, isolated life all by herself in a tiny cottage high up on the slopes of the Blue Ridge Mountains, several miles from the nearest village. She had 5 acres of pasture, a plot for growing vegetables, a flower garden, 3 cows, a dozen hens, and a fine cockerel. And now she had little Lexington as well. She was a strict vegetarian and regarded the consumption of animal flesh as not only unhealthy and disgusting, but horribly cruel. She lived upon lovely, clean foods like milk, butter, eggs, cheese, vegetables, nuts, herbs, and fruit, and she rejoiced in the conviction that no living creature would be slaughtered on her account, not even a shrimp. Once, when a brown hen of hers had passed away in the prime of its life from being egg-bound, Aunt Glosspan was so distressed that she nearly gave up egg eating altogether. She knew not the first thing about babies, but that didn't worry her in the least. At the railway station in New York, while waiting for the train that would take her from Lexington back to Virginia, she bought 6 feeding bottles, 2 dozen diapers, a box of safety pins, a carton of milk for the journey, and a small paper-covered book called The Care of Infants. What more could anyone want? And the train got going. She fed the baby some milk, changed its nappies after a fashion, and laid it down on the seat to sleep. But she read The Care of Infants from cover to cover. "There is no problem here," she said, throwing the book out of the window. "No problem at all." And curiously enough, there wasn't. Back home in the cottage, everything went as smoothly as could be. Little Lexington drank his milk and belched and yelled and slept exactly as a good baby should. And Aunt Glosspan glowed with joy whenever she looked at him and showered him with kisses all day long.